So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our speaker for today, Jacob Carlson. He will be presenting on building communities through digital storytelling. As the concept for what it means to be connected is constantly shifting, school remains a pivotal space for connecting students and their communities. This session will showcase an NEH-powered project that uses digital platforms to engage students in conversations with their communities. Highly adaptable to virtual classrooms, participants will learn about the life cycle of the project and get some hands-on time with one of the digital platforms provided by the Smithsonian Institute. Please help me welcome Mr. Carlson.
Hi, how is everybody? Like the introduction just said, we're going to be talking about digital storytelling as a means of building communities. My name is Jacob Carlson. I am a high school English teacher in Bethalto, Illinois. Bethalto is just next to Alton, Illinois, which is in the Metro East area of St. Louis. Our district, just as a kind of a history here of why I was so interested in digital stories, several years ago decided to shift to one-to-one teaching, which means that every student would receive a laptop or some kind of personal device. And at the high school where I teach right now, every student has a Chromebook. We had Macs a few years ago. We transitioned to Chromebooks recently. And with this digital project, I was able to navigate switching devices. And it has gone smoothly the past couple of years. And I wanted to share what we've been doing in our project with the hope that we can spread this format so others can benefit from it as well. So I'm excited to have all of you here. Please feel free, again, if you have questions, I don't mind pausing every once in a while to go ahead and answer questions that may not be on your mind. I understand I may overlook things because, like I said, I've been doing this a couple of years, and if something is useful that I didn't say, please feel free to drop a comment in the chat and I'll be happy to answer that for you. But for now, I'm going to share the presentation with you here. If you do not see my screen, please let me know. And we'll get started. So first, let's begin by talking about what is digital storytelling. This project it merges the in-person communication of storytelling with digital platforms that many students are excited to use. On the left here in this image, you can see a picture of an example that we're going to be looking at on a platform that I use called the Smithsonian Learning Lab. But a digital story is a place where you can host a story about your community from a storyteller. And because it's digital, it can have all kinds of different tools you can use to host it. So I'm going to show you a few of the ones that I have used in the past, but please understand that as you are comfortable with different digital tools you may have used, you may want to do more audio versions or digital video recordings or written platforms you can host online. This can look in any number of ways how you wish in your classroom. For students, this is a student-driven project that emphasizes communication, writing skills, and digital literacy. So when I decided to teach this as part of my classes, which is an option we'll talk about later today, I wanted to fuse the Common Core writing skills that I have to cover anyway into this unit. So I covered writing skills, I covered digital literacy and communication. For participants, people who are telling their stories, this is an opportunity to share stories that may not normally be heard in their community. So we'll get into this as well, but when we find participants, when we call for people to be engaged with this project, we're looking for anyone from our community who has a story to tell. And so we do a lot with working with our community and building that trust that we are handling their stories ethically and also providing a place for the stories to exist. So then for communities, this is a chance for all voices to be heard and to provide spaces for those critical conversations to happen. And as we know today, we are in desperate need of the ability to have conversations with those around us, both on a personal level, but then also on a social level. So this helps encourage that social level of storytelling and sharing so the community has a place to access these stories. Project purpose is twofold. One is to host community stories. So again, this is a way to provide a platform that these stories can exist, that they can be accessed by the community, they can be seen and read and reread and shared, so that people in the community can see the voices within their own community. The other purpose is to provide engagement with students and the community. Students will not often have opportunities provided by the school to actively engage with people outside of the school building. And so this is an opportunity for teachers to demonstrate what ethical, appropriate engagement with your community looks like, so that students can foster those conversations and understand how to gain perspectives that are outside of those that are within the school walls. This particular project was born out of an NEH grant and a partnership with Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. So I want to talk just a little bit about how it got started, because this is the way it was designed and originally implemented. But now we're talking about, in our group currently, I was just talking with some earlier today, about how this project will look going forward and how we want to continue spreading this to other schools. So this presentation today is part of that plan to help get projects like this continuing to spread throughout our schools here in Illinois. It was based on a 3-year model. So in the first year, we gathered students and we talked about what kinds of conversations were critical, that needed to happen. And I believe in the first year after the survey and the gathering of students, there was a summit, which you can see pictured there, where students were brought together. Many students decided that a difference in age, that perception of age, and how people are treated based on either their age or things that happen at certain ages was a conversation that needed to happen within communities. And so we decided to build our project around that idea first, talking about how do we approach age and age as a construct and how age can define people and how we can sometimes break out of those definitions. So this was designed to have moments to showcase those projects from start to finish, as well as to have moments where students can gather together to celebrate the projects. And then at the end of the 3 years, which is happening just now, we're talking about how to move beyond the scope of the grant. Southern Illinois University Edwardsville partnered with local high school teachers, and they were the ones who provided us tools and training and gathered us together to help get the seeds of this project planted in different schools around our county. Here are some important terms that we're going to be getting into, so I want to make sure that I'm very clear when I'm saying these terms, that you understand where we kind of agreed on the definition of these terms in our group. Digital story is a place where the facilitator connects the storyteller with the community. So a digital story is something that isn't owned by the creator, and meaning the student. We tend to think of the student sitting down, typing the story, making the project as the story maker. And I want to make sure that there's a difference here, that when we say digital story, that story belongs to the storyteller, the person who is giving that story, handing it over to the student to work with. So these digital stories are places where the storyteller can leave their story in the hands of the facilitator, the student, and trust that that story is put into a platform and created in a project that then will be accessible to others in the community. So the storyteller is the person that is actually telling the story. We also refer to this person as the interviewee when we talk about the interview process, or the participant. The facilitator, that's the student. That's the person who creates the digital version of the story, also referred to as the interviewer throughout this project. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a moment because we're going to get into looking at the process, and I want to switch my screen, so I'm going to stop sharing a second here. And I'm going to show you some examples of projects that have been done. So let me share my screen again, just so you have an idea of what it looks like to have a project created. So let's see. You all should be able to see my screen now, so please let me know if you cannot see it. This is an example of one of the student projects that we did using the Smithsonian Learning Lab. This is a relatively new platform. It came out a few years ago, and it was designed by the Smithsonian Institute as a way to give the public digital access to their archived resources. And then they added a component where people could log in and create their own digital archives. So I used this because it was a really neat way to host projects where you could have a mixture of written component, but then also pictures and some interactivity. These are called collections, and each item in here is a resource in the collection. And what's neat about it is we treat it like it's a gallery. So it's almost like this is a museum of the person that they interviewed, or a museum of the person of the storyteller. Now, as we all know, this year was a little different than previous years in that our schools all closed midway or at the beginning of the fourth quarter. So I switched last minute the goal of the project because I'm keeping in touch with students with a very hands-on project like this can be difficult from home. And I know all my students have different situations at home. So we switched it to talking about how COVID-19 have been affecting their day-to-day life. So some of these projects you're going to be seeing today are focusing on that, while some of the other projects are more in line with our previous goal. So in this project here called A New Normal, you can see that this student has written a gallery explanation talking about how, what is going on in the greater context around these pictures. And then the student just took pictures around her home. And if you click on any of these pictures, it brings it to full view. And you can see here what's happening in this image. And then you click off to the side and you can read what the student is saying about that image. And so this was the student's way of telling this story, what life is like at home during a pandemic. And so as we go through this gallery, the student paints pictures of what that life is like and helps us understand how her family has been affected by the school closures. So this is one example of what a digital project can look like. Another example of a digital project here, if I can change where the bar is located so I can actually click on it. Let's see, oops. Sorry, my toolbar is right in the way of the tabs. There we go. This was what a student created last year, and this was more in line with our previous theme, where students would create projects where they would ask their participants to think of 3 or more objects that help define them, especially at a certain age, thinking about that age as a construct theme that we had. And this group did a series of interviews with the person, and they hosted them on SoundCloud, and then they would have an accompanying picture. And so each episode of their podcast was focusing on a different object, and they had interview questions that they had designed, and then they met with the person and recorded the interview and put it together into this podcast style digital project. So as you can see just from these two very different approaches to what a digital project looks like and how it's hosted. But that is completely up to you as a teacher of how you want to handle that, what resources are available to your students. We didn't have a lot of good video editing software on our Chromebooks, so we opted not to go for documentary style ones. But I gave the students the caveat that if they did want to do that, they needed their own equipment and would have to meet with me on how to handle that. So other teachers, other districts had better access to video recording equipment that their students knew how to use. And so there's some awesome projects that utilize video recordings and more of a documentary style projects. So let me now stop sharing and go back to the presentation. Before I launch into the presentation, let's see if there have been any questions here. So I have a question. How many people were involved in my school? Was it just my class? Yes, so far it's just been my classes. Right now the project I've been implementing it first in my Honors English 3 classes. This is the year that we typically teach American literature. And so it is also in this year that we talk a lot about community and identity and what it means to have an identity, and how society is constructed and what part we play in it. So it has really worked well with that level of students. Plus, many of them are able to establish content with some of these community members in a little more independent way than my freshmen are able. I teach freshmen and juniors. And so that has been where I've kept it so far. I have 2 sections of that class. So I've had on average about 50 students each year, this year and last year, who've been involved in the project. We'll talk a little bit about how they handled getting into groups coming up, but that didn't mean I had 50 projects. I had 50 students each year who got into various sizes of groups to work on these projects. My plan is I'd like to roll this out into all the English 3 classes across our school, as well as try to get these into some of the nearby schools who weren't initially as part of our team. Great question. If there are any other questions that come up, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll go ahead now and get back to the presentation here. So let's talk about the process, because I showed you some examples, but how did we get to that moment? I broke it down into 3 basic phases. You have your context that you have to establish, you have your content that you need to think about, and you have the connection component. How are you going to connect with the community members? So we're going to dive into each of these 3 different categories here. But basically these all work together, and you're going to be figuring out how you're going to include this either in a classroom or in a club type setting. So the first thing you want to think about is your context. When you start thinking through your project, think through these questions. Who are the storytellers? These are the people who are going to be coming to you with their stories to share with your students. And at first, I mentioned that we started with this idea of age, and age as a construct. So in this picture here you see on the right, students were engaging with various community members of different ages, all the way from little kids to retirees. So we had all levels of people who were engaging with students in different walks of life. And the students would meet and ask questions and listen to their stories. And this provided a way for them to practice engaging with people. This particular activity was called a human library, where we had different people lined up, and the different groups can come and check out library books, so to speak. They would check out a person, bring them to their table, listen to their story, ask them questions, and then return the person in the next step and check out somebody new. So they had a chance to engage with different people, to think about this idea of age. You also want to think through who are the facilitators. So who are the students, or who are those people going to be creating these projects? Like I mentioned before, I started this in my Honors English 3 courses, but some schools decided it was best to put it in the format of a club, and that way it wasn't tied to curriculum. It could be set outside of the classroom and the constraints that came with that. So however you want to implement this, just keep in mind what your schedule is, what your content is. And it was easy as an English teacher for me to think of ways to merge this with my content, but maybe you're not an English teacher and you want to think of different ways to merge this with your content, or maybe it doesn't work in your class setting, but maybe a club would be great. So you can think through different ways to merge this with your own setting. You also want to think through what is digital storytelling. What kind of end product are you wanting to make? How are you wanting your students to engage with it? What are you wanting them to get out of it? Those types of questions. What will your focus be? Are you going to focus on something like age, or are you just gathering stories from your community to elevate voices? So will you have some kind of theme with your storytelling? When and where are the conversations occurring? So this one is an interesting one as a teacher, because you need to also make sure that you're protecting your students, that you're showing them what it means to make sure that they're being ethical in how they handle their interviews and how they reach out to people, that they're treating their stories well, but that also that they understand that many of your students will be minors, and that you are providing spaces for your students to meet safely with others in the community, and having accountability with that. So when and where are you going to have these meetings? I often hosted meeting spaces after school in my classroom or in the library at our school. We would talk about using public spaces like libraries in the community, places like McDonald's Cafe, which you can't use right now, so don't plan on that. But how you can use public spaces. And in fact, right now you can think about using digital platforms, since many people have grown comfortable with them, or at least used to them. And then think about why tell stories. Why are you doing this project? Why use a digital platform? And this is where you're going to need to begin training your students, thinking about why are we doing this? We did a lot of readings up front with the students, thinking about age, thinking about conversations and the importance of having them. We had a lot of model text that showed us the importance of having conversations. A favorite one, for instance, I always like to use is Margaret Wheatley. She wrote, oh, it's the one that has disturbed in the title, and now it's escaping me, of course. Willing to be Disturbed is the title. And so our willingness to enter into conversations or territory that might be a little disturbing for us, because it's not how we think, but how to enter into that with humility and with preserving the story of the person, and how to have that conversation. So once you think through your context, so how you're going to be handling it and which classes, you want to start thinking about your content, how or if you're going to be merging this with what you're teaching. You may be in a position where your content or your standards allows you to implement and assess a unit that includes digital storytelling and the skills that come with it, writing skills, reading skills, discussion skills. But maybe your content doesn't allow for that as easily. So maybe you want to host a project like this over a longer period of time, but outside of class as an extracurricular or a club. So you want to be thinking about these questions. Do I want this to be part of a required unit in my classes? Some of the teachers in this project, when we first did this, we had it be a required component. I found it easier to require it among my honor students because I knew that I could offer them access to tools where I could easily require them to use those tools. But it may not be the case that every body of students that you teach will have access to those tools. So you need to think through, do I want to require this and how I want to handle that? Or would it be better as part of a voluntary club where we hold each other to expectations, but it is not assessed? What readings can we use to model good story facilitating? Like I mentioned, Margaret Wheatley's Willing to be Disturbed is one we often read prior to this lesson. We also use Adichie's TED Talk on the danger of a single story and stereotyping and how stories, especially a multitude of stories, can give back to a community. I also teach the book, The Things They Carried, to my juniors that year, and we use the lessons on storytelling that come from that book to talk about the goal of the storytelling we want to do in our projects. So there's all kinds of ways you can infuse this with your content. So we'll get more to that. I'll be happy to answer questions about decisions I made with that too a little later on here. You need to ask yourself too, what can we do in our discussions to model conversations that will take place? I took it for granted that students know how to talk to adults because, as you know, juniors, they're 17-ish years old, and it seems like they can talk to adults or talk to teachers just fine. But when it comes to asking interview questions, the first time I tried this, I saw that many students would ask one question, and then they would get a response, and then they would sit for a second and then say, okay, we're done, thank you. So how do you teach students to actually have conversations and discussions? How do you teach them to listen for interesting little tidbits in a conversation and then push for those and to learn more about those rich small details that may be dropped throughout an interview? So I actually had moments in our classes where we would practice interviewing, and I would be a practice person that they can first ask questions of, and I would bring in objects that I would start talking about, but then I wouldn't give much information, and then they can practice with me. I would bring in other teachers so that they could practice interviewing them. So lots of practice, showing them how we can have rich conversations even in an interview process. And then thinking also, like, when are we going to have practice for this in our classes, or are we going to have practice outside of classes? It did take up some of my content time. I did have to change a little bit of my curriculum. I had to rethink when I taught things and how I taught things to try to fit this into my lessons. So that is something you'll want to carefully think through. You certainly just don't want to start the year saying, hey, you know what, I want to do this in my classes without having set aside when and how this is going to happen in those classes. And finally, you want to think through what tools you want to use. You certainly want to practice the tools yourself. I made several Smithsonian lab projects before I assigned this to my students because I wanted to make sure I understood what it was capable of, but also what its limitations were and what possible obstacles students would run into. There were several obstacles. There was this weird glitch where pictures would constantly get flipped over, but I had encountered them myself and found ways to get around it so that we can get through those moments smoothly in our classes when teaching this unit. And finally, this last component, of course, is the connection piece. How are we going to get students in conversations with their community? This is really one of the biggest goals of the whole project, getting students talking to their community members, talking to people who may not be just like them. And so I asked myself, how will I engage with our community? How will participants even learn about us? On my website, I put call for participants, but not everybody visits my website. So I printed up flyers and I took them down to the community night that our school held. And I set up a little table and just passed flyers. Hey, we're doing this project. Please come share your stories. You don't need to be the mayor. You don't need to be work on the fire department. You can be just anybody. Anybody can come and share their story. And I try to encourage people to come forward and answer questions that they may have. How will I ensure that conversations are productive, safe, and continual? And that last piece is really important, that I'm not just there to grab their story and run, that I'm there to enter a conversation with them and constantly check in with them to make sure the story is being handled ethically, that they're comfortable with the story and the product that's being made and then being shared, and allowing them to have control over how and when that gets shared all the way through the entire life cycle of the project. I think through where will I publish these? For me, I use the Smithsonian Learning Lab, but I also connected them to my website as well as SIUE's. I'm sorry, is there a question? And then lastly, I think through, oops, let me go back here. How will we be celebrating the stories with the students in the community? And part of the grant and partnership with SIUE was that we were able to have these summits at the end of the year where students could get together and share their projects and hear what students are doing at other schools. So they had a chance to communicate with students in other schools as well as students in their own schools. Okay, I have a couple of questions here. Question is, did you collaborate at all with your school librarian besides using the library space? That is a great question, Amanda. Thank you for asking it. And unfortunately, I have to say no, because we don't have a school librarian. We have a school library, but right now we don't have a staffed librarian with a library science background. And so we utilized the tools that were in the library, but we didn't have that partnership with a librarian. You definitely want to pursue that though. You want to talk to your media center specialist or your staff librarian to talk about ways that you can use that space, because honestly, you don't want to have to do all the heavy lifting yourself, right? You're going to have enough on your plate as a teacher, especially if you're going to be a new teacher, and partnering with somebody who's been at the school and understands kind of the ins and outs of the system there is really going to be helpful. Yes, so if you have, so you'll be a first-year school librarian. Yay, that's awesome. So this might be a project that honestly is handled really well by a librarian. I did it in my English classes because I was kind of the contact person at my school. But I could easily see a school librarian spearheading this project and maybe offering it as what's it called when you can do things during lunch? Maybe like a club or an activity before, during, or after school, or maybe partnering with some other classes. A social studies class would be great to have this. A current events class would be great to have this. So there's all kinds of possibilities there for school librarians to be involved in this project. Absolutely, that's a great point. I pulled this slide from one of the resources, and you can see I have it there at the bottom of the page. I'm going to put some of these links in the chat as we go as well, so that I know you can't click on my PowerPoint here, so that you can access these later. But this is from a presentation called Digital Storytelling, Ethical Considerations, and the Facilitation Process. That's one of the resources on our website. This is something that can be easily missed when you're thinking of designing a project, but is really important because you want to think about, this is all about the storyteller. You want to think about their well-being throughout this entire project. You want to make sure that you are making them comfortable in how you're contacting them, as well as being safeguarding the students with that contact. You want to make sure that you have continual consent in the story sharing process. On our resource website here, on the IRIS SIUE website, we have forms that students use when they are getting the stories from the storytellers. That these are forms, consent forms that the storyteller shares back with us, saying that they understand how their story is being used, and they can actually check different levels of how they want it to be shared when it's finished, depending on how comfortable they are with it. And I have to teach my students to continue checking back in with the storyteller to say, what do you think of the project? What do you think of it, handling it this way? Even asking for more information or a follow-up on some of the stories they share. So we teach this communication process as being a cycle, not just a one and done interview deal. We talk about knowledge of production and ownership, that the storyteller knows that what is happening in each step and knows that they own the story, even if somebody else is making it and hosting it. It is their story. And at the end, if they're not comfortable with what they shared, with the facilitator, being shared with the community, they have the right to withhold that. So make the students aware that, you know, they may be disappointed that their storyteller may not want the story shared by the end, but they're still doing good work even if it doesn't get shared out in a broader way. We talk about the need for local relevance, that these stories have to come from people in our community, that these stories have to be from they have to be relevant to the people that where we're embedded with the school. So we're not going all over the internet searching for people far and wide. We are looking for people here in our community to share their stories. How you do that in different settings looks different. We are in kind of a mixed rural and suburban district where we're right on the edge of the Metro East of St. Louis. So we have cornfields to one side, and we have oil refineries and sprawling interconnected cities onto the other. And so getting people connected with us was a little bit of a challenge. So you want to make sure that you're contacting people who can help get your story shared. Maybe there are community centers where you can host this every once in a while. Maybe have somebody there, volunteer yourself to say, hey, I'll be here to answer questions, or we'll put up information in a kiosk for people to have. But there's different ways that you can engage with your community in that way. Don't underestimate your school as a community resource center as well. I know we mentioned librarians already, but that could be a great place to have a kiosk to share this kind of information as well. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about implementation. So these are just suggested timelines, and then finally some resources to end out today. So how do we implement this into our context? You want to think through, do I want to have it in my course, or do I want to have it in the club? And I have some pros and cons here. I ultimately chose a course because for an English teacher, I can easily embed it within my community. I was able to, within my curriculum. I found ways to assess it within my unit. So I made the final project be equivalent to an essay. So it counted as one of their major essays for the quarter. I did that by requiring certain amount of writing overall total across the project. So it depended on the number of objects they had or the number of pictures that they had needed to caption. I assessed them on the Common Core writing skills that we were covering that unit anyway. So what's nice is I was not assessing them on the story itself. I was assessing them on the quality of their production with it. You need to think, do I want my students doing this individually? Do I want them doing it in groups? How am I going to organize them within the classes? I allowed students to select their own small groups with this because I knew it required them working outside of class time on it. And I found that at the junior level, often students who know each other personally on some level are able to communicate more consistently when they're putting in their own time after school on it. Also, many students who were friends were in the same sports or in the same clubs, so they're able to work around that a little bit easier. But there's all kinds of ways you can do this. You can pair students up intentionally. You can have students work individually, or if this is a club, you can have, or especially if it's a small club, you can have everybody working on the same project. And then you want to think through what kind of training within my class time do I want to offer with this. So you do have to set aside class time if you're doing this in a class. Please keep that in mind, that I would say it all told between the practice and the project itself, it took probably about a month's worth of time to really make sure this project was done well. I chose to spread it over the whole year. So we would have lessons, text that we would read, writings we would do, discussions we would have, starting in the fall, going all the way through the culmination of the final projects in the spring. If you do this as a club or an extracurricular, of course, that will look different. You have more flexibility in how you want your students to be organized, the time frame you want it done in, but you won't have that crucial class time to have hands-on time with students to do training and to hold them to some of those assessed skills that you may want to have. So just keep those in mind as you're doing this. Here is a long-term timeline when you're thinking about how to implement it. So at the first stage, you want to learn yourself all about the project. So this is where you plan your implementation and you do your own research, find the text you want to use, basically thinking about how you would construct a unit of curriculum. This is kind of what you're doing here. You're going to have a period of time where you're modeling for students what these conversations look like, what the projects look like. And so you're going to engage students with the theory, ethics, and goals of the projects. You're going to have readings and discussions. Some teachers did this as its own unit, so that they would set aside the month to actually have readings on this or practice with this and have it done all within that month's time. Like I said, mine was spread out over the whole year, which has some benefits and that a little more flexibility in the amount of time students have to work on it, but it certainly also has its own drawbacks in that we don't have a consistent focus time to work on it. So depending on how you want to handle this is entirely up to you, but there are different models for it. And finally, you're going to introduce moments of practice. Then you're going to have the storytelling piece where you're actually working on those final projects. And then you're going to be having a time where you're sharing it out, getting it to the community, but also having time to just celebrate with students and letting them see each other's projects. Here's a sample of my unit's timeline. So pre-unit, which would have been in the summer, I gathered forms. These are those consent forms we talked about, gathered other materials like readings we wanted to do, did some research on it. And at the beginning of the fall, I introduced the project and I got the forms out, got stuff about my website, put up my call for participants so the community was aware that we were doing this project. But I didn't really get into the project just yet. Then in the second quarter, so you're looking more into November, we started doing early unit lessons. At this point, we're getting into the things they carried. So we started to have class conversations around the role of storytelling in communities. We had readings and we would talk about all the, you could say, the academic sort of theory behind why we're doing this project. I also had them do a Smithsonian Learning Lab project on their own objects. So they did basically a miniature version of the project on themselves. So they can practice the tools, but also practice how to gather objects and write about them. Then in mid-unit, so this is early second semester, looking in January, February, this is where we'd actually practice doing interviews. We were arranging participants. So all those people who contacted me, I started handing those contact informations out to groups or handling them, contacting them myself as needed. And we began actually getting the interviews arranged and getting student materials set up. And then late in the unit, you're looking at the beginning of fourth quarter, end of third quarter. This is where we would be heavy into the interview process, but also be making the projects, having that feedback loop where we were checking in with the participants to make sure they were comfortable with what we were making, and finalizing the projects. And then finally, post-unit at the end of the year, this is where we would publish the pieces and share them out with the community. So that was a sample of mine as a year-long process, but you can also condense this down into a single month if you're wanting to do it all at once. And as we wrap up here, I want to point out here a few resources. And as we have our conversation, I'll be adding these in the chat. Here we have the Conversation Toward a Brighter Future resource page. We'll go to that here in a second. But we also on the same page have digital story examples. And then I have my website as an example of how as a teacher you can share out the projects on your own